Imagine walking through a city center in the early 20th century.
Right.
And the architecture around you is just breathtaking. I mean, massive, ornate buildings that literally rival the finest avenues of Paris. You can hop on a subway system before most of Europe even, figured out how to dig the tunnels.
Yeah, they were way ahead.
Exactly. The wealth is so staggering, so incredibly visible, that a popular phrase among the European elite at the time was literally, as rich as an Argentine.
It's wild to think about now, but it was the ultimate destination. I mean, millions of immigrants were actually bypassing the United States.
Wait, really? Bypassing the U.S.?
Oh, yeah. Completely bypassing New York to board ships headed for South America because the wages down there were higher and the opportunities just seemed, limitless.
Okay, so that is the image we need to hold in our minds for this. A top-tier, hyper-wealthy nation operating at the absolute cutting edge of global prosperity.
The very top.
Because what happens next is, well, it's the ultimate economic plot twist. This nation doesn't get conquered by a foreign army.
Right.
It doesn't get wiped off the map by some localized apocalypse or a devastating plague. It slowly, methodically, and inexplicably slides backwards.
That's a slow burn.
It slides all the way from the penthouse of global wealth down into decades of just relative poverty and financial chaos. And this happens over an entire century.
Which is, that trajectory defies almost every conventional model we have about human progress and economic development.
Yeah.
Countries just don't do that.
They really don't.
Yeah.
History only has this one terrifying example of this happening on such a massive, sustained scale. So, today, you are going on a deep dive into the tragedy of Argentina.
It's a fascinating, if depressing, case study.
Totally. And we are pulling the foundation for this deep dive from an incredible working paper by Alan M. Taylor from the National Bureau of Economic Research. He looks at this not just as some, historical quirk, but as a system-wide collapse.
And the research here is incredibly methodical. Taylor's work breaks down the exact anatomy of this decline. It removes all the mystery and replaces it with cold, hard mechanics.
Right.
It shows how specific choices regarding trade, legal structures, and capital allocation systematically dismantled a wealthy society.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start by really anchoring us in how high that peak actually was, because you cannot fully grasp the vertigo of the fall unless you look down from the very top, So take us back to 1913.
Right. So 1913 is the crucial benchmark year. The world is on the brink of the First World War, obviously, but the preceding decades were an era of massive global integration. And in 1913, Argentina was an absolute titan.
Like, how big are we talking?
Based on per capita income, they were literally one of the 5 richest countries on Earth.
I find that statistic so difficult to process when looking at the modern world. Top 5.
Top 5.
So they were richer than France.
Yes.
They were richer than Germany.
Yeah. Only Britain was ahead of them in Europe. They were standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States, Canada, and Australia as these incredibly prosperous, land-rich settlement nations. There's actually an old, somewhat dark joke that floats around economic circles regarding this very paradox.
Oh, I love a dark economics joke. Let's hear it.
Well, it goes, there are only 4 kinds of economies in the world: advanced, developing, Japan, and Argentina.
Wow. Okay. It's funny, but it carries a pretty brutal truth, right? Because Japan is the miraculous outlier on one end of the spectrum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Going from a deeply isolated feudal society to a hyper-advanced global powerhouse in a remarkably short time.
And Argentina is just the mirror image of that.
Yeah, they are the lone spectacular exception on the other side. They are the only notable case of a nation starting at the absolute pinnacle of global wealth and then transitioning to a comparatively poor, struggling economy.
So let's fast forward to today just to set the contrast for everyone listening. Where do they stand right now compared to that 1913 peak?
Today, Argentina's per capita income hovers at roughly 40% of the Western European average.
Less than half.
Less than half. They didn't just stagnate, they actively lost ground against their peers. We usually talk about the Great Divergence.
The idea that rich countries get richer and poor countries grow slower?
Exactly. That historical trend where rich countries compound their wealth and pull away. Argentina completely shattered that model. I mean, they were already on the top floor, and they somehow found a way to walk backward down the escalator while everyone else went up.
But wait, let me challenge that premise for a second. Because is it possible that 1913 was just a mirage? Like maybe they weren't actually building a fundamentally rich society. Maybe they just had a massive commodity bubble, like selling beef and wheat at inflated prices, and when the bubble burst, they just reverted to their natural state.
Yeah, it's a compelling theory, and honestly, is where most people's minds go first when faced with a collapse this large. We want to find a simple scapegoat.
Right, it feels too crazy otherwise.
But the data from Taylor's research completely dismantles that idea. Their prosperity in 1913 wasn't a brief 5-year flash in the pan. It was the result of decades of sustained compound growth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they were building real infrastructure, real cities, and real wealth.
Okay, so if it wasn't a temporary bubble, then we have to look at the usual suspects. Because when economists study why certain nations struggle to develop, there's a whole framework of excuses, right? Or what they call deep determinants.
Yes, the deep determinants theory. It essentially argues that a country's economic destiny is heavily weighted by fundamental, unchangeable factors. Usually this falls into a few categories like geography, disease environment, and the legacy of colonial institutions.
So if a country is struggling today, someone will inevitably point to the fact that, oh, it has a sweltering tropical climate where agriculture is difficult.
Right.
Or they'll point out that tropical diseases like malaria historically devastated the workforce and discouraged long-term European settlement.
Or perhaps most commonly, they point to the colonial past. The argument is that empires set up extractive institutions in certain colonies.
Right. They didn't build schools or courts to protect rights.
Exactly. They just built mines and ports to strip the wealth out as fast as possible. And those broken institutions supposedly cursed the nation forever.
But this is where the Argentine story delivers a massive face slack to conventional wisdom. Because Argentina breaks every single one of those rules. Let's look at their geography. It is not a steaming, impassable jungle.
No, not at all.
It features the pampas, which are some of the most beautiful, fertile, temperate plains on the planet. I mean, it is geographically identical to the American Midwest.
And because of that temperate climate, they didn't suffer from the crippling tropical disease burden that hindered development in other parts of the world. It was heavily settled by European immigrants who moved there to stay, to build families and businesses.
Okay, but what about the society they actually built? Did they inherit a broken, extractive colonial system that doomed them to inequality and poverty?
The historical evidence says absolutely not. By the year 1900, their social indicators were incredibly strong. I mean, they had high literacy rates, a very robust and expanding education system, and a functioning democracy that was actively expanding suffrage.
Wait, really? So they essentially had the exact same starter pack as Canada or Australia?
Exactly the same starter pack.
They had the land, they had the climate, they had the immigrants, and they had a functioning society.
What's fascinating here is how the initial level of inequality right after their independence turned out to be a terrible predictor of their ultimate trajectory. People often assume that Latin American countries were universally cursed by their colonial origins. Right?
Yeah, that's the standard narrative.
But Argentina's institutions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were highly functional. They weren't pristine utopias, of course, but they were demonstrably capable of supporting a wealthy, advanced nation. I mean, they proved it by reaching the top 5 globally.
So we have a country where the climate didn't fail them, the geography didn't fail them, and their initial colonial legacy didn't doom them. If we strip away all those convenient excuses, what actually caused the rot?
Well, we have to look at the invisible architecture that governs human behavior, the rules of the game. We have to look at the law.
And this is a terrifying concept to me. The idea that a country's legal system can physically devolve. Because we think of progress as a one-way street, right? Laws get more refined, courts get more just. Can a legal system actually mutate and decay right alongside the national bank accounts?
The historical correlation in Argentina is undeniable. To understand the decay, you have to look at their original blueprint. Their Constitution of 1853 was a masterpiece of classical liberal design. It was heavily inspired by the United States Constitution.
And a crucial part of that inspiration was the integration of common law features, right? With the most vital of those being judicial review.
Yes. Let's break down why judicial review is the bedrock of an economy. It is the mechanism that allows an independent judge to look at a law passed by the government or an action taken by the executive and declare it illegal or unconstitutional.
Right. It is the ultimate emergency brake on absolute power.
Exactly.
Like if the government suddenly decides it wants to seize your factory or arbitrarily change the terms of your business contract, an independent judiciary steps in and says, no, the Constitution protects this individual. That gives investors the confidence to build the factory in the first place.
But as the 20th century progressed, That structural bedrock in Argentina began to fracture. And it wasn't a sudden explosion, you know.
Yeah.
It was a slow, silent mutiny against the 1853 Constitution. The entire legal philosophy of the country began to swing away from those protective common law traditions.
They shifted toward a rigid, codified civil law approach. But how does that actually play out in reality? Like, how does a philosophical shift in a courtroom destroy a country's wealth?
In practice, it meant the withering of jurisprudence. The independent power of judges to protect individual rights and enforce contracts against the will of the state eroded, whether under military dictatorships or, populist democracies. The executive branch increasingly consolidated power. The courts were packed, ignored, or just completely sidelined.
So the referees were essentially taken off the field.
That's a great way to put it.
The government could just change the rules of the game at halftime, and there was no one left to blow the whistle. And if you look at a timeline mapping the decay of their judicial independence, it perfectly mirrors the timeline of their long-term economic decline.
When the rules lose their meaning, the concept of a long-term contract becomes a joke. And when contracts become a joke, the money simply stops flowing. You cannot build a complex, multi-decade industrial economy in a place where the legal foundation is literally made of sand.
Okay, so we've established the height of the fall, and we've looked at the crumbling legal foundation. Now I want to get to the math. We need to measure the actual physical size of this crater. How much wealth evaporated due to these systemic failures?
Well, economists use a very specific metric to measure this gap between where Argentina is today and where the rich world, the countries they used to peer with, currently sits. They measure the shortfall at roughly 1,000 log points.
Okay, hold on. Let me make this real for you. Because 1,000 log points sounds like a minor academic discrepancy.
Which it sounds tiny.
It is not. That measurement means that if you could magically wave a wand today, erase a century of bad policy, and restore their economic efficiency to the level of their peers, Argentina's national income would instantly jump by 150%.
It is a staggering visualization of a self-inflicted wound.
They are operating at a massive 60% wealth discount compared to where they should be. Just imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that for the rest of your life, you will only receive 40% of your paycheck simply because of the rules your own household voted to implement. That is a 60% wealth wipeout.
And the brilliance of Taylor's NBER paper is that it doesn't just point at the 60% crater and shrug. It breaks down the exact anatomy of the disaster. The research manages to definitively diagnose exactly half of this massive gap.
Right. We can trace the bleeding to two massive severed arteries in the economy. 20% of that total wealth loss comes directly from self-inflicted trade barriers, and another 25% comes from something the paper calls capital accumulation friction.
Which is an incredibly polite, sanitized way of saying they created an environment so toxic that it actively scared money away.
Right. So let's dive deep into that first massive chunk of the disaster. The 20% of their wealth that was sacrificed at the altar of trade barriers. How does a nation lock itself out of global prosperity?
It usually starts as a reaction to fear. When the global environment becomes chaotic or threatening, the most primal human instinct is to retreat, to pull up the drawbridge and lock the doors from the inside. But in economics, that instinct is suicidal.
Look at the baseline. Before World War I, Argentina was a hyper-connected trading powerhouse. Their total trade imports and exports combined equaled a massive 80% of their GDP.
80%.
They were intimately wired into the global economic engine.
Then the 20th century arrived with a vengeance. You have the chaos of the 1920s, followed by the devastating global shock of the Great Depression in the 1930s. The outside world looked terrifying. So Argentina panicked. They pulled up the drawbridge. That 80% trade figure went into a free fall, plummeting to under 20%.
And the tragic part is, when the rest of the world eventually calmed down and re-engaged, Argentina just left the doors locked. They permanently normalized isolation.
Yeah, and you can see the mechanics of this isolation clearly in their tax code. Before 1910, if an Argentine farmer or business wanted to export their goods to the world, the export tax was literally zero.
Wow, zero.
Zero. There was no penalty for succeeding on the global stage. But fast forward to 1960, the government had cranked import taxes up to roughly 15%. And they simultaneously cranked export taxes up to roughly 15%.
Oh my God. That creates a combined, crushing 30% penalty just for attempting to do business across a national border.
Exactly.
Let's put this in perspective. It's like owning a world-class bakery. You make the best, most efficient bread in your entire region, But suddenly, your own town council passes a law. They charge you a 15% tax on the flour you buy from the next town over, and then they charge your delivery drivers another 15% fee just to drive your bread out of the bakery's parking lot.
It's madness.
You aren't being beaten by the competition, you are being strangled by your own security guards.
It is the intentional strangulation of a nation's competitive advantage.
Yeah.
And there is a massive misconception about why this isolation destroys an economy so thoroughly.
Yes, this is a huge point. Because when people think about closed borders and high tariffs, they usually assume the damage comes from missing out on shiny new technology.
Right.
The assumption is, oh, if we close the borders, we won't get the latest smartphones or the newest software or the most advanced computers from abroad, and that will make us fall behind.
Economists refer to that as a loss of total factor productivity, driven by a lack of technology transfer. The idea that you lose out on the innovation spillover from global leaders.
But the data in this research completely slaps that theory in the face.
The numbers are incredibly clear. That lack of technology transfer, missing out on the newest foreign innovations, only caused about a 5% drop in their income.
A 5% drop is practically a rounding error in the context of a 60% wealth wipeout.
Exactly.
So the technology scapegoat is a complete myth. What was the real killer hidden inside these tariffs?
The real devastation wasn't about missing out on futuristic technology. It was about the skyrocketing cost of basic survival for businesses. High tariffs act as a massive, invisible tax on the fundamental raw materials of the economy.
Oh, wow.
The research shows that 2/3 of the tariff damage came from the sky-high cost of intermediate parts, and the remaining third came from the exorbitant cost of capital goods, things like industrial machines, factory equipment, and tractors.
This completely unravels the political rhetoric used to sell tariffs, because politicians love to say, we are raising tariffs to protect local industry by local.
But high tariffs don't protect local industry. They suffocate it.
Right.
Consider the reality of an Argentine farmer in this closed system. He has a tractor. The tractor breaks down. In a free trade system, he buys a replacement gear from the global market for $100.
Makes sense.
But under the tariff regime, he is forced to buy a domestically produced gear. Because that domestic producer faces no international competition, the gear is lower quality and it costs $300.
Holy crap. When you force that farmer to pay triple for a basic replacement part, you aren't protecting him. You are bleeding his profit margins dry.
Exactly.
He has less money to invest in better seeds. He hires fewer farm hands. His overall harvest shrinks.
And when you multiply that dynamic across every factory, every farm, and every logistics company in the nation, you silently erase 20% of the entire country's wealth.
That is insane.
All to artificially prop up a domestic parts manufacturer who is entirely inefficient. It is an invisible transfer of wealth that shrinks the total pie.
Okay, so locking the doors and suffocating businesses with the cost of basic parts explains nearly half the damage. But what about the other 25% of that massive wealth gap, the capital accumulation friction?
To understand this, we have to look at the terrifying reality of a country where profits are high, but absolutely no one wants to invest.
Which is wild, because in the 1990s, Argentina actually experienced a significant productivity boom, right?
Yeah.
The mechanics of the economy were revving up, things were getting more efficient.
But they suffered from a severe pathology known as capital shallowing. Normally, when a country becomes more productive, investment capital floods in to take advantage of that efficiency.
Sure, that's how it's supposed to work.
But in Argentina, the capital accumulation completely failed to keep pace with the productivity. The engine was running beautifully, but nobody was willing to put gas in the tank to make the car move forward.
And here's the statistic that completely breaks your brain. During this period, the actual return on capital, the pure measurable profit potential in Argentina, was an astonishing 50% higher than in the United States.
A 50% premium on the marginal product of capital.
Okay, let me push back on this because it feels like a total paradox. Investors are fundamentally greedy. Capital follows the yield.
Right.
If you hand me a prospectus that proves I can make 50% more profit building a manufacturing plant in Buenos Aires than I can building one in Ohio, I'm going to wire the money to Buenos Aires immediately. Why wouldn't the global market flood them with cash to capture that 50% premium?
This raises an important question, and that paradox is the crux of the issue. Why leave a 50% profit margin sitting on the table? Because that 50% wasn't a reward for good business, it was a massive risk premium.
Oh, it was hazard pay?
Precisely. Investors weren't demanding a 50% higher return because they were feeling greedy. They demanded it because the mathematical probability of losing absolutely everything they invested was terrifyingly high.
So why was the environment so toxic? Why did an investor need a 50% buffer just to be able to sleep at night?
Because in the Argentine economic ecosystem, catastrophic disasters weren't rare black swan events. They weren't once-in-a-century shocks. They were a standardized feature of the environment. They were
Wow.
practically household pets sitting in the living room.
Who on earth is going to authorize the construction of a massive, complex industrial facility? A project that might take a decade just to break even, when there is a highly realistic chance the government might legally steal the entire operation tomorrow morning.
You would be violating your fiduciary duty to your shareholders to take that risk without a massive premium. The history of Argentina throughout the 20th century is a highlight reel of wealth destruction.
We are talking about hyperinflation on a scale that is hard to comprehend. Inflation that completely eats nominal debts and turns a lifetime of savings into dust over the course of a few months.
We're talking about massive, systemic bank collapses, brutal credit crunches where the flow of money simply freezes, and businesses go bankrupt, not because they are unprofitable, but because they simply cannot access a bridge loan to make payroll.
But the ultimate poison, the thing that truly kills generational trust, wasn't just bad luck with global commodity prices. It was the fact that the government actively, deliberately, and repeatedly destroyed property rights.
If we look at this purely mechanically, stripping away the political justifications used at the time, the actions taken by the state were a masterclass in how to eradicate investor confidence.
Let's list the offenses. Serial debt defaults. The government borrows billions and then simply refuses to pay it back, over and over again.
Then you have bank suspensions. The infamous corralito. This isn't abstract high finance. This is average citizens and local businesses walking up to an ATM or a teller and being told, by law, that they cannot withdraw their own cash.
That is terrifying. You also have forced conversions of currency. Asymmetric pacification.
Right.
Imagine having a bank account with 100,000 US dollars in it. And the government passes a law declaring that overnight, your account is now worth 100,000 local pesos at a fabricated exchange rate that wipes out 2/3 of your purchasing power. They literally changed the math on your life savings against your will.
And of course, outright confiscation. The state seizing private assets, nationalizing industries without fair compensation, and taking wealth by force.
When a state treats private wealth as a piggy bank to be smashed whenever the budget gets tight, capital flees. It runs screaming for the exits.
Capital is the oxygen of progress.
Yeah.
You cannot build a modernized, diversified economy without it. If the state continuously threatens the oxygen supply, the patient dies. It is that simple.
But I want to explore a nuance here. It's not like every single dollar left the country. Some money did stay. Domestic businesses still existed. Some people still invested locally.
True, a certain baseline of capital remained. But even when the money stayed inside the borders, it was poisoned by the environment it was forced to operate in.
Let's talk about the physical manifestation of that poison, the hidden rust.
When economists build models to project a nation's wealth, they assume that physical assets, roads, bridges, power grids, factory machines, wear out over time. The standard assumption is a depreciation rate of about 6% a year.
Which makes sense. It's the cost of entropy. Machines get old, belts snap, concrete cracks.
But the data from Argentina reveals a horrific reality. Because of systemic corruption, a profound lack of routine maintenance, and severe economic friction, the real depreciation rate of their capital stock was double the standard estimate.
We are talking about a 12 to 16% annual decay rate. Their assets weren't just aging normally. They were rapidly crumbling to dust. The infrastructure was rotting from the inside out because nobody had the incentive or the resources to maintain it.
And the tragedy compounds. Because whatever new capital was being injected into the system, the fresh money trying to grow the economy, was suffering from severe internal bleeding.
Misallocation.
Exactly the term. In a healthy, functioning market, capital is brutally efficient. It flows toward the smartest innovators, the best products, and the most efficient business models.
But in an environment where the government controls access to imports, licenses, and foreign exchange, the money stops flowing to the best businesses. It starts flowing to the best connected.
Capital allocation becomes an exercise in political cronyism. The funding goes to the people who play golf with the Minister of Trade, not the engineers who know how to build a more efficient widget.
The research highlights an astonishing metric regarding this misallocation. If Argentina could somehow fix this single issue, If they could just stop the cronyism and let money flow naturally to the most productive firms instead of the politically protected ones.
The math suggests it would be the equivalent of a massive 50% boost in their overall total
Yeah,
factor productivity,
50%.
just by moving the existing money into the right hands.
So it's not just that they have less water in their bucket due to capital flight. The bucket itself has massive holes in it, and the water they do manage to carry is being poured deliberately onto the weeds instead of the crops.
The compounded inefficiency is staggering. But we haven't even touched upon the darkest, most insidious side effect of those massive tariffs we discussed earlier.
Right, the invisible killer of innovation.
We already covered how tariffs made machines more expensive. Economists call that the intensive margin. The thing you want costs more money.
But there is a much more destructive force at play, the extensive margin.
Tariffs didn't just raise the prices of imported goods. They completely eradicated the variety of machines and inputs available to Argentine businesses.
This is crucial. Imagine you were trying to build a cutting-edge 21st century product. Maybe it's a new type of medical device, but your government has banned or heavily taxed the import of modern specialized microchips, insisting you buy locally.
Right.
Except the local industry only knows how to make basic 1990s era circuitry. You aren't just paying more for a chip, you are legally prohibited from accessing the specific tool you need to innovate.
When local businesses are isolated from the vast, diverse, and highly specialized global supply chain, innovation simply dies in its sleep. You cannot build a modern economy if your engineers and creators are locked in a room with only half a toolbox.
It is an impossible handicap. So we've walked through the mechanics of the suicide. We see the tariffs suffocating trade. We see the destruction of property rights terrifying investors. We see the cronyism misallocating the capital that remains. We see the lack of variety killing innovation. Which brings me to the biggest, most glaring question of this entire deep dive.
The motive.
Yes. If all of these policies are so clearly mathematically and historically suicidal, why on earth did generations of politicians keep doing them? You don't just accidentally destroy 60% of a nation's wealth over a century. You have to actively choose to do it over and over again across different administrations and different decades.
To understand the why, we have to examine a concept called reverse path dependency. It is the study of how a single massive external shock can permanently mutate a nation's political DNA.
Take us back to the catalyst, the 1930s.
The Great Depression was a seismic event that crushed global trade. Every nation on Earth felt the impact. But in Argentina, this shockwave fundamentally rearranged their internal power structure.
Because before the 1930s, the political power in Argentina was largely held by the outward-looking agricultural elites, the people who owned the pampas. They made their fortunes selling beef and wheat to the British Empire and the rest of the world. Because their wealth depended on exports, they fiercely advocated for free trade and open borders.
But when global trade collapsed during the Depression, the economic power of these agricultural elites evaporated, and nature abhors a power vacuum.
So as the outward-looking elites lost their grip, a new faction clawed its way to power, an inward-looking industrial interest group.
This new coalition championed protectionism. Their rallying cry was, "The global market has failed us. Close the borders. We must build everything locally to be self-sufficient."
Now, I can almost understand that logic in the immediate panic of the 1930s. The whole world was burning. Closing the doors felt like a rational defensive mechanism.
But here is the tragedy. The 1930s ended. World War II ended. And in the 1950s and 60s, the rest of the world woke up. They realized isolation was a dead end. Europe, the U.S., and eventually parts of Asia dropped their tariffs, opened their borders, and ushered in an era of unprecedented global wealth creation.
But Argentina refused to join them. They kept the doors bolted shut. Why didn't they pivot back to free trade when the crisis was over?
Because those temporary panic-driven policies of the 1930s had birthed a monster. They created a massive, entrenched system of rent-seeking, a parasite economy.
The new political class realized they had a golden goose. They used the closed borders to forcibly extract wealth from the highly efficient, world-class agricultural sector.
Through those massive export taxes and manipulated exchange rates we talked about, the state siphoned billions of dollars away from the farmers. And where did that money go? It was handed directly to the low-efficiency, highly protected domestic industries.
Industries that were conveniently controlled by the new political coalition and their cronies.
Exactly. They essentially built a machine that legally transferred wealth from their political rivals to their political allies.
They kept the destructive, suicidal policies alive for decades, even as they watched the nation slide into poverty, even as the 60% wealth gap opened up, because they were personally profiting from the isolation.
We must look at this dispassionately, purely as an exercise in economic incentives. When an interest group gains the legal authority to trap a nation's wealth inside its borders and the power to siphon that wealth into their own pockets, they will fight to the death to keep those borders closed. The national interest becomes entirely subservient to the special interest.
It is the ultimate betrayal of a nation's potential. An entire century of prosperity sacrificed to feed a parasite.
And that brings us to the ultimate synthesis of the Argentine tragedy.
Let's look at the wreckage clearly. Argentina wasn't killed by a sweltering jungle climate or a geographic curse.
It wasn't killed by a lack of access to foreign technology or the legacy of a colonial empire.
It was systematically dismantled from within. It was choked by punitive trade tariffs that doubled the cost of survival. It was starved by a ruthless, unpredictable legal system that destroyed property rights and terrified investors. It was bled dry by crony capitalism that poured precious capital onto the weeds.
And it was held hostage by a political class that found it far more profitable to isolate their citizens and extract their wealth than to let them compete on the global stage.
Which brings this entire deep dive crashing into the present moment. Look out the window today. Look at the headlines.
We are currently witnessing a massive global retreat from the principles of free trade.
We are seeing protectionism violently roaring back into fashion across the developed world. We are seeing new sweeping tariffs celebrated as political victories. We are seeing a massive rise in populist rhetoric, promising to protect local industries by locking out the world and dismantling the very supply chains that built modern wealth.
The exact same political impulses, the exact same fear-driven logic, and the exact same promises of self-sufficiency that birthed the Argentine tragedy in the 1930s are echoing loudly right now in capitals all over the globe.
Which leaves us with a terrifying question to ponder. Are the wealthy, advanced nations of today blindly stumbling down the exact same path? If you aggressively lock the doors to protect yourself from the world, are you actually just locking yourself in a cage? Think about that.